Behind me here, we have 7 250 4-stroke dirt bikes that we've been riding, racing, and testing. And in this video, we're gonna tell you the pros and cons of each new bike, and then we're gonna rank them from first to worst. But first, thanks to Maxxis for hooking us up with their new MXIH intermediate hard terrain tire across all 7 bikes to make sure we had fresh rubber for our final test. And thanks to Risk Racing for hooking us up with 7 new stands that have the adjustable top to level out each bike and come with a trick new magnet. With all that being said, let's get into the details of each bike now. Starting with the most expensive bike in the class, the 2024 Husqvarna FCT50 retails for $10,299. On the dyno, this thing peaks out at 44.78 horsepower and it hits 21 foot-pounds of torque, and it weighs 224 pounds on the scales. The FC250 is the white, gray, and yellow brother of the KTM and Gas 250 models. And this bike is positioned to be a little more vet-friendly and user-friendly. However, it's not cost-effective. As I mentioned, it's the most expensive bike in the class. What do I mean by user-friendly? Well, this bike has a more mellow power band that still pulls to impressive high RPM numbers, but is a little more muted on the bottom end when compared to KTM. Because of the closed-off airbox, the subframe is different on this bike. These grab handles right here are completely closed off, and it's getting less air into the engine, which makes for a smoother pull coming out of corners, less excitement, but more of a mellow power band. Also, the big one about this bike, 1 inch lower at the seat. That's due to the shorter forks and the longer steel head on the shock. Same framework as the KTM, same chromoly steel frame, same engine, but the slightly lower chassis creates a unique experience for Husqvarna riders that have the map switch and all of the premium offerings that KTM has at just a slightly different option. Next up, the 2024 Honda CRF 250. This bike is the current champion in both 250 Supercross and Motocross. On the scales, this bike is the lightest bike in the class at 219 pounds. On the dyno, it hits 40.78 horsepower at 11,900 RPM, and it hits 19.7 foot-pounds of torque. The Honda CRF 250 is one of 3 250 4-strokes that has a low to mid power band. That 40.78 horsepower peak, not very impressive when you compare it to the 44 and 45 numbers of some of the other bikes. But what this bike does well is it comes out of corners with authority. And this is something that it really appreciates for novice and vet riders, also intermediates and guys who like to ride in the low to mid power band. If you rev it out, this thing is not gonna make a whole lot of power, but if you keep it in its meat of its horsepower, that's where it does its best work. Another thing we love about this bike, ergonomics. Foot peg to seat, seat to handlebar, this bike is perfect. Honda sets the standard for the rider triangle. Also, the Honda Red is beautiful to look at. The biggest problem with this bike though, the show of forks. Spring forks in the front are extremely stiff. They're like Supercross forks and they'll rattle your teeth out of your skull. No good in its stock form, and that's one of the biggest complaints about this bike. The 2024 Kawasaki KX250 is the fastest bike in the class, just slightly beating out the KTM at 45.11 horsepower on the dyno. It peaks out at 13,300 RPM with 21 foot-pounds of torque. As for weight, this bike is also the heaviest bike in the class, 228 pounds, retail price of $8,799. That's the Kawasaki KX250. The KX250 has a strong engine that you have to completely rev out to get all of its horsepower. As I mentioned, slightly beats the KTM, but it also follows suit with KTM's philosophy of being high revving, and that's where you find the meat of the power on this KX250. One thing we like about the KX 450, which shares the same chassis, the 450 is a very stable and well-mannered machine. When you use that same frame and concept on the KX 250, it's a lot harder to turn, and then you couple that with the ultra stiff KYB spring forks, and it makes it very hard to ride on the track and not user-friendly, especially for novice and light riders. One thing that we did for our KX 250 over the past couple years is we stuck Ride Engineering's 22 mil offset triple clamps on that help bring the front wheel in a little bit, get a little more weight on the front end so you can turn easily in the corners. Like I said, this is MXA's stock 250 Shootout. We test each bike in their stock form, letting you know how they run when you buy the bike at the dealership. KX 250 has a lot of pros, like the high RPM engine, but a lot of cons with that stiff fork and a little bit difficult turning with this chassis. This is the Yamaha YZ250F, and it is all new for 2024, following in the footsteps of the YZ450F last year. It retails for $8,899. The updated engine hits 42.58 horsepower at 12,700 RPM with 19.6 foot-pounds of torque, and it weighs in at 224 pounds. So what do I mean by following in the footsteps? Well, this is basically a YZ450 with a 250F engine inside of it. The engine mounts are slightly different to hold that 250 in the cradle, but everything else is identical to the YZ450F, which we very well liked last year, and it actually won our 450 Shootout, which meant that we had high hopes for this new YZ250F model this year. Only minor changes to the engine for 2024, namely the airbox. The airbox is bigger now. It follows the footsteps of that 450 airbox that came last year. 30% more volume on the clean side of the air filter. Talking with Mitch Payton and the Pro Circuit guys, this has a big effect on how the engine runs. Also, the cam chain tensioner are all new in this bike as well to boost durability on this YZ250F engine. This engine is known for being strong coming out of corners, not having the same peak horsepower as the Kawasaki, KTM, and some of the other models, but it is a well-liked horsepower on the track that a lot of people appreciate. And because of that, we're thankful that Yamaha didn't stray too far for their engine for 2024.
Dude, those goggles.
This is the KTM 250 SXF for 2024 with only some minor refinements to the suspension. This bike retails for $10,199. It hits the dyno at 45 horsepower at 13,000 RPM with 20.8 foot-pounds of torque. As for weight, this thing hits the scales at 224 pounds. On the track, the KTM 250 SXF is the most racy version of this bike when you compare it to the Gas and Husqvarna. It does come with the map switch. It doesn't have the restrictor in the muffler, and it has all the horsepower because of the vented airbox and the vented subframe. If you look here on the subframe, it's got basically grab handles so you can stick your hands through. You can see all the way through with air vents going straight down into the airbox, making this bike more responsive coming out of corners and carry more horsepower through the RPM range. The KTM 250 SXF also has the most holdup in the suspension. It's got the WP Exact air forks in the front, the WP shock in the back, but the valving is a little more racer orientated than the Gas and Husqvarna models, making this bike a truly race-ready model. You might be wondering what this is. The Suzuki RMZ 250 is the only bike with the Kickstarter for 2024. This bike retails for $8,099. On the dyno, it hits 39.6 horsepower with 19.6 foot-pounds of torque, and this bike weighs 227 pounds. This is the first time we've ever included a mod bike in our 250 Shootout. How come? Because this is exactly how you buy it. Suzuki is offering a special RM Army Edition bike through December 31st, where you can buy a Suzuki RMZ 250, and it comes with a full Pro Circuit T6 exhaust system, header, muffler installed. Also comes with RM Army Edition graphics, which we chose not to put on our test bike. So we're testing it with an aftermarket muffler because that's how it comes when you buy the bike stock now up until December 31st. Long story short, the RMZ 250, it needs some help, and we're appreciative that Suzuki and Pro Circuit have partnered up to offer something more exciting to this bike that hasn't changed in the last few years. We do know, however, that Ken Roxon has done extremely well on the RMZ 450. We recently tested his bike. We found out that he actually likes the RMZ 250 triple clamps on his 450 four-stroke, and he uses a lot of other stock parts. This bike is outdated, it's got a Kickstarter, but it's good to know that Suzuki's at least trying to make some more incentives by adding on a Pro Circuit exhaust. Finally, we have the Gas MC250F, which is the second bike that is all new for 2024. This bike retails for $9,399 with a peak horsepower of 43.25 at 13,800 RPM with 20.4 foot-pounds of torque. And on the scales, the Gas weighs 225 pounds. This bike jumped up to the new platform that KTM and Husqvarna gained last year in 2023. Gas was a year behind. Now they're up to speed with the two brothers. This bike has the skeletons of a KTM with the chromoly steel frame and the high horsepower engine, but there's lots of little differences that Gas used to save a little money on the price, make it a little more affordable, and to tune the character of how this bike rides on the track. So what are the differences? Namely, the subframe. Closed off airbox, allowing less air into the engine, making for a smoother ride on the track. This bike also has a restrictor screen in the muffler, which detunes power, as well as the map switch. You don't get a map switch stock on this bike. You can buy one in the aftermarket, but it doesn't come stock, which means this bike is stuck in map 1. You don't have access to map 2, which is the aggressive map, more horsepower, and you don't have traction control or quick shifting when it comes stock on this bike. Some other major differences: softer suspension in the WP Exact air forks, softer valving, also BrakeTech brake components, and hydraulic clutch actuation. Now, BrakeTech was bought by Brembo, but it is not Brembo quality. Yes, it's improved from what we saw last year on Gas off-road bikes. BrakeTech brakes were no good on those models. They've upped the braking power for 2024 on this bike, but it's still not Brembo quality. Same thing with the clutch. Other differences: taller silver handlebars on this bike, and it's got completely unique bodywork, as well as the forged aluminum triple clamps. All these subtle differences are used to drop the price, but also tailor how this bike works on the track. Coming in 7th place, it was an easy choice for this one. It's the Suzuki RMZ 250. The Suzuki is a polarizing bike. You either love it or hate it. Our test rider, Brian Medeiros, he personally loves the banana bikes, and he takes them every year for us. But the RMZ 250 has no horsepower, ultra stiff forks, an ultra stiff aluminum frame as well that makes it a rigid and a harsh ride on the track. It's something that you have to learn to love. Our test riders, they've heard all the comments, they've read all the internet reviews, and they were actually surprised that the bike was better than they expected it to be. Especially first-time Suzuki riders that hopped on the bike today and over the last couple weeks. They were impressed with how well it cornered and with how well it pulled out of corners. The Suzuki RMZ 250 has a strong low-end grunt. However, the overall weight and the low total horsepower, along with the rigid chassis and the rigid forks, make this an easy choice for dead last. Coming in 6th place is the Honda CRF 250. It's always easy to put Suzuki in 7th, but man, it's a shame to put Honda in 6th because we know that they've tried hard on this bike and they've made changes to make strides forward with their CRF 250 in the past few years. This bike was all new in 2022, and personally, it makes the best power for a novice level rider on the track. We have many test riders in the MXA Wrecking Crew, and our lower level novices and also our older vet riders who aren't as high experience with revving the RPMs way to the moon on their CRF 250, they like the low to mid grunt that this bike has. Suzuki has a good low to mid grunt, but the Honda is best in class off the crack of the throttle, making it the easiest engine to ride, and that's our favorite aspect about this bike. However, also, same as the Suzuki, the forks are incredibly stiff, way too stiff to be sold stock off the showroom floor, way too stiff for any regular motocross rider. Also, the frame is rigid as well, making it a more finicky bike that's a little harder to get used to. We love the low to mid grunt on the CRF 250, but it peters out quickly, peaking at only 40.78 horsepower, making it the second slowest bike in the class, and that's just not enough to win MXA Shootout. Coming in 5th place, the Kawasaki KX250. We love the high horsepower RPM that comes with this bike. It hits 45 horsepower, just over 45 on the dyno this year. It actually nudged out the KTM, which was the highest horsepower bike last year. Both bikes didn't change, but this KX250 just edged out the KTM, making it the strongest in the class. But it's another story of stiff forks. KYB does the forks on this bike as well, and they are incredibly stiff on the Kawasaki KX250. And like I mentioned at the top of the video, with the 250 engine inside of the 450 chassis, it's difficult to turn the KX250. It understeers coming into corners, and that's something that is really difficult for us to get front tire bite and feel comfortable on this bike in its stock form. A few mods that we recommend, definitely getting a revalve to soften up the front forks. Also, Ride Engineering's 22 mil offset triple clamps bring that front wheel in, make it a little easier to turn on this bike as well. Big knocks against Kawasaki, the bolts strip out easily and they fall out easily on this bike, as well as the plastics crack, especially the fork guards. One thing, the T-plate bolts that hold the seat on, they fall out easily. We replace them with bolt hardware T-plates that stick in there for good. Long story short, the Kawasaki KX250, it's a high RPM revving machine. It's got a strong engine, but a chassis that's very difficult to get used to. Coming in 4th place, you might be surprised by this one because I sure am. It's the Yamaha YZ250F. We had high hopes for this bike with the all-new chassis and the updated engine, but it did not meet our expectations. The original test days and in our original test video, we talked about the low RPM lull and the bog that came off of the crack of the throttle. I should correct myself. It's not really a bog. It's just the new style of power on this YZ250F that takes a little bit of clutch work and takes a little bit of effort to get into the meat of the power, where previously this bike was like the Honda CRF 250 that picked up initially, and that was what everybody loved about the Yamaha power band in the past. Now, the new YZ250F, because of the bigger air box and the bigger intake, it's sucking more air into the engine, and because of that, it detunes the power just slightly off the crack of the throttle. In our original test video, I talked about the bigger cam chain, the bigger cams, and the bigger cam chain tensioner, all boosted to be stronger for durability on the YZ250F. I talked about that being the reason why the YZ250F isn't so responsive off the crack of the throttle. Mitch Payton, had a long talk with him. He corrected me. He said, you know what? It's probably not the cam chain. It's probably the bigger air box that came off of the 450 on this new bike. That's most likely what we're feeling on the track. The dyno confirmed what we thought. The new YZ250F is slower off the crack of the throttle and actually slower a couple more times on the curve when compared to last year's YZ250F. And then it picks up on the very top to be a little bit stronger at the very top of the RPMs. Long story short, on the track, this bike has a heavy deceleration feel. It's got a twitchy front end and a less responsive initial crack of the throttle, making sure that this bike is 4th place and just barely 4th. I almost wanted to put the Kawasaki and Honda ahead of it, but overall, Yamaha is still an impressive bike, but it did not meet our expectations. So as you can see, the Yamaha YZ250F is less than impressive off the crack of the throttle. Honda CRF 250 way above the rest of the bikes, while the Yamaha is way below the rest of the bikes all the way through until you get into the higher RPM range, and it still is beaten out by Kawasaki, Husqvarna, KTM, and GasGas. Coming in 3rd place, it's the GasGas MC250F. I already mentioned that this bike was all new for 2024, catching up to the KTM and Husqvarna with the all new chassis and engine. Ultimately, it comes in 3rd place because it's the least race-ready bike when it's compared to its brothers, but it is still more raceable than the Yamaha, Honda, Kawasaki, and Suzuki. The GasGas is ultra smooth coming out of corners and it pulls strong down the straightaways. This bike doesn't have the map switch, it doesn't have the stiffer suspension, it does have a restrictor in the muffler, and it has less air going into the airbox. All these things slightly detune the GasGas to make it different from KTM and Husqvarna. Long story short, This bike isn't as race ready off the showroom floor, but it's still a great platform that was good enough to beat the rest. Coming in second place is the Husqvarna FC250. Now, in one sense, we want to complain because KTM has 3 different brands with all the same engine, all the same chassis. But in the other sense, we have to be thankful because Stefan Pierre, the owner of the Pierre Mobility Group and the 3 different brands, he revitalized both Husqvarna and GasGas, who previously weren't doing so well in motocross industry. Now we have 3 different brands on the track. Stefan Pierre has employed many different factory riders, many mechanics, and many different people in the motorcycle industry because of Husqvarna and GasGas. The differences are minor, but they're actually bigger than you think when you separate the GasGas, Husqvarna, and KTM. The Husky story, lower, much lower. We had all of our riders do a round robin run, hopping on each different bike today, and when they hopped off the KTM and jumped on the Husqvarna, they all talked about how much lower it was to the ground. If you get comfortable in the Husky, it doesn't feel low, it feels like your normal bike. It corners exceptionally well because of the lower center of gravity, but for pro level test riders like myself and Dennis Stapleton, we personally like the GasGas and KTM chassis more with the extra suspension travel, especially on the new generation frame and suspension that came in 2023. The Husqvarna is more tailored to vet riders, novice riders. Some of us pro riders, we prefer a little more suspension travel, while the Husqvarna is perfect for vet riders and novices. Every year during shootout season, we're tasked with the project of ranking the bikes from first to worst, and our curriculum for ranking and our process is to determine which bike is the best stock motorcycle in the class that you can buy yourself and take out to the track. This year, it's the KTM 250 SXF that takes the cake. It's the best overall race bike that comes in stock form. Before we get into the praises of this bike, we do have some complaints to list off first. The spokes do come loose, which means you need to check them at regular intervals, especially when you're breaking in new wheels. Also, it's difficult to get plastics from KTM, Husqvarna, and GasGas right now. KTM is suffering from COVID, long COVID really, because they cut off their manufacturers. They used to sell their plastics to Acerbis and to other manufacturers to remake them and sell them at dealerships. Now KTM has taken all that in-house. They said you can only buy aftermarket plastic straight from KTM, and they don't have any in stock. So that's one big complaint. A lot of other parts are out of stock right now for KTM models as well. So those are some other complaints we have. And the air forks are a big one. Air forks come stock on KTM, GasGas, and Husqvarna, and you have to check them regularly throughout the day of riding, or else the pressure will bump up if you let your bike sit in the sun, or if you're doing motos all day and you're building up that pressure inside, it'll end up being harsh on the track. So air forks, you need to spend some extra attention keeping an eye on those. Besides that, the KTM 250 SXF sets the standard in the motocross industry, especially the clutch. They use a one-piece steel clutch basket with the primary gear made into it. That sets the standard for clutches in the 250 class. KTM, Husqvarna, GasGas, they're the only factory teams who use the stock clutch in their factory race bikes. The Japanese brands cannot say that. Also, the front end traction was one of the main compliments that our test riders felt on the KTM chassis, as well as the engine. It's the strongest in class. I did mention that Kawasaki has a tiny more peak horsepower, but the overall pull through the RPMs, KTM takes the cake. This is a race ready model that we appreciate, and it's our best recommendation from the MXA Wrecking Crew. All right guys, thanks for watching our 250 shootout video. If you want more information on each bike and a more detailed written article, check out the January issue of Motocross Action Magazine, where we'll have everything in there, the full shootout. Also, subscribe to our YouTube channel to check out our individual bike test videos on each model, and check out our website, motocrossactionmag.com. Got lots of information on these bikes. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.